Listen, what I'm about to tell you happened just last year in the sprawling, unforgiving wilderness of the American West. And it's going to completely recalibrate everything you thought you knew about the animal kingdom. You know those stories that sound like they were cooked up in a Hollywood writer's room? The ones that are just too perfect, too emotional, too unbelievable to be real? Well, this story is one of them, except every last word of it is true. Picture this. A tiny, weathered cabin perched on the edge of a vast national park. The kind of place where the silence is so profound it has a sound of its own. In that cabin lives Eleanor Vance, a 78-year-old woman with eyes the color of the winter sky and hands gnarled from a lifetime of hard work and harder goodbyes. Eleanor had been a widow for 20 years and had kept to herself for just as long, finding more comfort in the company of pine trees and passing clouds than in people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She was tough, resilient, and had forgotten more about the wilderness than most so-called experts ever learn. But her heart had been in a deep freeze for 2 decades, locked away after a tragedy that had stolen her spark and left her preferring solitude. On this particular morning, a cold snap had descended on the valley, painting the world in shades of silver and gray. The air was thick with the promise of a monster storm, the kind of blizzard that old-timers talk about for generations. Eleanor was sitting at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, when a sound shattered the morning peace. It wasn't the call of a bird or the rustle of a deer. It was a deep, guttural moan, a sound of such profound anguish that it seemed to make the very air vibrate with sorrow. It was a sound that didn't belong. Eleanor grabbed her late husband's old binoculars and stepped onto her porch, her breath misting in the frigid air. And what she saw made her heart stop. There, at the edge of her property, just beyond the rickety fence line, stood the largest bull bison she had ever seen. He was a magnificent, ancient creature, a true patriarch of the plains. His massive, shaggy head was bowed, and his dark, intelligent eyes were fixed directly on her cabin, on her. He wasn't threatening, he wasn't aggressive. He was doing something Eleanor had never witnessed in over 50 years of living in this valley. He was begging. The sound came again, a desperate, soul-shaking plea that resonated with a grief so powerful it transcended species. This wasn't just an animal making noise. This was a being communicating a desperate need for help. Eleanor, a woman who had actively avoided contact with the world for 20 years, felt a pull she couldn't explain. Every instinct told her to go back inside, lock the door, and wait for whatever was happening to pass. But something in the bison's gaze, a look of shared sorrow, of profound loss, held her captive. What could possibly make a 2,000-pound king of the wilderness plead for help from a tiny, old woman? What kind of tragedy had unfolded in the secret heart of the park that would drive this magnificent creature to seek out a human? Eleanor didn't know it yet, but she was standing on the precipice of an encounter that would not only change her life forever, but would also provide irrefutable proof of animal intelligence and emotional depth that would leave scientists and wildlife experts absolutely speechless. She was about to discover a secret hidden in the wilderness, a secret that would force her to confront her own frozen heart and fight for a life she never expected to care about again. What do you think this massive bison wanted? And what could a 78-year-old woman possibly do to help him? Share your thoughts in the comments, because what happens next is a story of courage, intelligence, and a bond so powerful it will bring you to tears. Eleanor watched for nearly an hour as the colossal bison, who she had already started calling the patriarch in her mind, continued his strange and heartbreaking vigil. He would pace the fence line, then stop, fix his gaze on her cabin, and let out that gut-wrenching moan. It was a display of deliberate communication so clear, so intentional, that it defied all conventional wisdom about animal behavior. This wasn't random. It was a specific appeal directed at the only other living soul. For miles, against her better judgment, Eleanor pulled on her warmest coat, a faded red parka that had seen her through countless winters, and grabbed a sturdy walking stick. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew she couldn't just stand there and watch this creature suffer. As she approached the fence, the patriarch stopped his pacing. He stood perfectly still, his massive form a silhouette against the ominous gray sky. He watched her every move, not with aggression, but with a desperate, waiting intensity. The air crackled with a tension that was almost electric. "What is it, old man?" Eleanor whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "What's wrong?" The bison responded by turning his massive head and looking back toward the dense forest from which he had emerged. Then he looked at her again and took a single deliberate step back, a clear gesture of invitation. He wanted her to follow. This is where the story takes a turn that will make the hair on your arms stand up. A wild animal, a bull bison known for its unpredictable and often dangerous nature, was asking a human for help. It's the kind of thing you read about in storybooks, not something that happens on a cold Tuesday morning in the middle of nowhere. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. Every rational thought screamed at her to turn back. But the look in that animal's eyes, the sheer weight of his sorrow, was a force she couldn't resist. She unlatched the old gate, a gate that hadn't been opened in years, and stepped onto the protected lands of the national park. The patriarch waited until she was through, then turned and began walking slowly, purposefully, into the trees, stopping every few yards to look back and make sure she was still following. The journey was tense. Eleanor was acutely aware of her own vulnerability. She was a 78-year-old woman, following a 2,000-pound wild animal into a forest where bears and mountain lions roamed. But the bison's behavior was so full of focused intent that her fear was overshadowed by a burning curiosity. What could he possibly need to show her that was worth this incredible risk? After a walk of nearly half a mile, a journey that took them deep into a secluded, ancient grove of aspen trees, the patriarch stopped. He stood beside a massive fallen log, his body trembling slightly, and let out a soft, mournful sound unlike the desperate pleas from before. This was a sound of pure grief, and then Eleanor saw it. Lying on a bed of frosted leaves was the body of a female bison, her life clearly gone for several hours. Her form was peaceful, but the ground around her told a story of a difficult struggle. It was a tragic sight, but it was what lay nestled against her still warm body that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. 3 of them. 3 newborn bison calves, impossibly small and fragile, huddled together for warmth against their deceased mother. They were so new their coats were still damp, their spindly legs barely able to hold them. They were perfect. Tiny replicas of the giants they were meant to become, but now they were orphans, completely helpless against the elements and the predators that would surely be drawn to the scene. The patriarch looked from his lost mate to his newborn children, then back to Eleanor, and the meaning of his desperate plea crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't been begging for himself. He had been begging for them. This grieving father, this powerful king of the plains, had faced an impossible situation. He had lost his mate, the only one who could nurse and care for his offspring, and he knew, with an intelligence that defied explanation, that he couldn't save them alone. So he had done the unthinkable. He had overcome his natural distrust of humans and sought out the only help he could find, a reclusive old woman in a remote cabin. He had led her here, to the scene of his greatest tragedy, and in a silent, powerful language, he was placing the fate of his children in her hands. If this incredible moment of interspecies communication and trust touches your heart, do me a huge favor and hit that like button right now. Your support helps us share these amazing, true stories of animal intelligence with the world. And if you're not already subscribed, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button, because the courage and ingenuity that Eleanor and this bison display next is something you will not want to miss. For a long moment, Eleanor could do nothing but stare, her mind struggling to process the scene before her. The raw, unfiltered tragedy of it was overwhelming. The dead mother, the grieving father, and the 3 tiny, shivering calves who had no idea their lives were hanging by a thread. The air was thick with the smell of pine, damp earth, and death. One of the calves let out a weak, bleeding cry, a sound that pierced Eleanor's frozen heart like a hot knife. In that instant, 20 years of self-imposed isolation, of numbly going through the motions of life, melted away. She wasn't just a spectator to this tragedy anymore. The patriarch had made her a participant. She looked at the massive bull, who stood watching her with an unnerving stillness, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. He had done his part. He had overcome his instincts and brought her here. Now it was her turn. The first and most immediate threat was the cold. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the sky was growing darker, promising the arrival of the blizzard by nightfall. These calves wouldn't survive an hour in the open once the storm hit. They needed shelter and a source of warmth immediately. The second threat was starvation. They were newborns, desperate for the rich colostrum from their mother's milk, a vital substance that provides critical antibodies and nutrients. Without it, their chances of survival were slim to none. And the third threat, Eleanor knew, was already on its way. The scent of death travels fast in the wild, and it wouldn't be long before opportunistic predators like coyotes or even a bear arrived to investigate. She had to act, and she had to act now. "Okay, old man," Eleanor said, her voice finding a strength she hadn't felt in years. "Okay, I'll help you." The patriarch seemed to understand. He let out a low rumble, a sound of acknowledgement, and took a step back, giving her space to work. Eleanor's mind, which had felt foggy for 2 decades, was now razor sharp. The practical knowledge from a lifetime spent on this land came rushing back. She couldn't possibly carry 3 calves half a mile back to her cabin. But she had an old toboggan in her shed, one she and her late husband had used to haul firewood in the winter. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. "You stay here," she instructed the bull, pointing a firm finger at him. "You guard your babies. I'll be back." The journey back to her cabin was a frantic race against time. Her 78-year-old legs protested, but she pushed on, her mind already working through a checklist of what needed to be done. She found the toboggan, dusted off the snow, and grabbed every old wool blanket she could find. Then she went to the pantry and found what she was looking for, a dusty can of powdered calf milk replacer she kept for emergencies, and a few old baby bottles from a time long past. As she hurried back toward the grove, the first flakes of snow began to fall, fat and heavy, sticking to her parka. The wind was picking up, moaning through the pine trees, a harbinger of the fury to come. When she returned to the clearing, her heart leaped into her throat. A pack of 4 coyotes was circling the scene, their lean bodies slinking low to the ground, their yellow eyes glowing with hunger. They were testing, probing, looking for an opening. But the patriarch was a fortress. He had positioned himself between the predators and his calves, his massive head lowered, his horns ready. Every time a coyote dared to dart in, the bull would charge a few feet, a terrifying display of power and intent that sent the predators scattering. He wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was a warrior defending his legacy. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She let out a fierce yell and charged toward the coyotes, brandishing her walking stick like a weapon. The sudden appearance of a second unexpected defender was enough to break the coyotes' resolve. They were opportunistic scavengers, not frontline fighters, and a battle on 2 fronts was more than they had bargained for. With a few parting yaps of frustration, they melted back into the forest. The patriarch watched them go, then turned his attention back to Eleanor, his deep chest heaving. He had held the line. Now they had a small window of time. Getting the calves onto the toboggan was a challenge. They were weak but surprisingly strong, and their instincts told them to stay close to their mother. Eleanor spoke to them in a low, soothing voice, the same voice she had used on countless frightened animals over the years. She gently but firmly lifted the first calf, a tiny female, and placed her on the blankets. The calf was shivering violently, her small body radiating cold. The patriarch watched her every move, his eyes filled with an astonishing level of trust. He seemed to understand that this strange human was their only hope. One by one, Eleanor loaded the 3 small, precious bundles onto the toboggan. The 2 females were weak but stable, but the third, a little bull, was alarmingly limp. His breathing was shallow, and he barely reacted when she lifted him. He was the weakest, the one who would have been the first to perish. Now for the hardest part. Pulling a toboggan with 3 calves, even small ones, through half a mile of increasingly dense snow was a Herculean task for a woman of her age. She wrapped the rope around her waist and leaned into the weight, her muscles screaming in protest. The journey back was a slow, agonizing crawl. The snow was falling faster now, blurring the edges of the world into a swirling vortex of white. Behind her, walking a respectful but protective distance, was the patriarch. He was her escort, her guardian, ensuring that no other predators would dare approach his precious cargo. It was a surreal procession, an old woman, 3 newborn bison, and a 2,000-pound bull, moving as one through the heart of a gathering storm. They were a makeshift family, forged in tragedy and bound by a shared will to survive. Have you ever seen an animal display such clear strategic thinking and courage? This bison wasn't just acting on instinct. He was making choices, assessing threats, and placing his trust in a potential enemy to save his family. What does this tell us about the emotional lives of animals? The sight that would have greeted any observer was one for the ages. The tiny red-clad figure of Eleanor Vance, leaning into the wind and snow, her face a mask of grim determination as she pulled the toboggan. And behind her, the colossal, dark shape of the patriarch, a silent, hulking guardian against the storm. They reached the relative safety of her property just as the full force of the blizzard began to unleash its fury. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the trees and piling snow into massive drifts. Getting the calves from the toboggan into her small, warm cabin was another battle against the elements. The little bull calf was fading fast. His body was cold to the touch, and his breathing was barely perceptible. Eleanor knew he was dangerously close to death. She worked with a desperate urgency, her movements precise and efficient. She laid the 3 calves on a bed of blankets in front of her old wood-burning stove, the one part of the cabin that was always warm. The 2 females, though weak, began to revive almost immediately in the gentle heat, their shivering subsiding as they huddled together, but the little bull remained motionless. Eleanor's mind raced back through decades of animal husbandry knowledge. She had to get his body temperature up, and she had to do it quickly. She briskly rubbed his small body with a warm, dry towel, trying to stimulate his circulation. Then telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mix the powdered milk replacer with warm water, testing the temperature on her wrist, just as she had done for countless other creatures she had saved over the years. Getting the bottle into his mouth was difficult. He was too weak to suckle. Eleanor gently pried his mouth open and squeezed a few precious drops of the warm milk onto his tongue. For a moment, there was no response. Her heart sank. Had she been too late? And then, a flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible swallowing motion. A sign of life. A spark of fight in the little creature. She squeezed another drop, and then another. Slowly, painstakingly, she managed to get a small amount of the life-giving fluid into him. Outside, the patriarch stood at the fence, his body coated in a thick layer of snow, his massive form a bulwark against the raging storm. He hadn't left. He was standing watch, his gaze fixed on the warm, glowing window of the cabin where his children were. He couldn't come inside, but he was present, a silent, powerful partner in this desperate fight for survival. Throughout the long, terrifying night, as the blizzard raged outside, Eleanor fought for the life of the little bull calf. She continued the feedings every hour, a few drops at a time. She rotated the warm blankets, keeping a constant, gentle heat on his fragile body. It was an exhausting, all-consuming effort. The two female calves were now sitting up, their dark eyes watching her with a mixture of fear and curiosity. They were out of immediate danger, but their brother's life still hung in the balance. As dawn approached, the storm began to lose its intensity, the howling wind softening to a mournful sigh. The world outside was transformed, buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Eleanor, exhausted but resolute, was still by the little calf's side, and she noticed a change. His breathing was deeper, more regular, his body felt warmer. She offered the bottle again, and this time he latched on. It was a weak, fumbling attempt, but he was suckling. He was fighting. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, tears of relief and exhaustion. She had done it. She had pulled him back from the brink. When the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a brilliant crystalline light over the snow-covered landscape, Eleanor looked out her window. The patriarch was still there. He had stood his vigil through the entire storm, a testament to a father's unwavering devotion. He looked toward the cabin, and though she knew it was impossible, she could have sworn she saw a look of gratitude in his ancient, intelligent eyes. But their ordeal wasn't over. In fact, a new kind of challenge was about to begin. The blizzard had isolated them completely, but it had also attracted attention. Later that morning, Eleanor heard the unmistakable sound of a snowmobile engine. Approaching, it was the Park Service. A young, well-intentioned, but by-the-book park ranger named Ben Carter had come to check on her after the storm. And what he was about to find in her cabin would set off a chain of events that would pit Eleanor's hard-won wilderness wisdom against the rigid rules of bureaucracy. The story of what this incredible bison did and how Eleanor fought to protect his legacy was about to become a local legend. What would you do if you were in Eleanor's position? Would you have trusted the bison? The arrival of Park Ranger Ben Carter was both a relief and a source of profound anxiety for Eleanor. On the one hand, he represented a connection to the outside world after a night of terrifying isolation. On the other, he represented rules, regulations, and a worldview that often had little room for the kind of miracle she was currently harboring. In her living room, Ben was in his late 20s, ambitious, and dedicated to the principles of wildlife management he had learned in college. He saw the world in terms of policies and protocols. When he knocked on Eleanor's door, his primary concern was her welfare after the blizzard. "Mrs. Vance? Ranger Carter." "Just doing a welfare check after the storm," he called out, his voice muffled by the door. When Eleanor opened it, the sight that greeted him made his jaw drop. His by-the-book training had not prepared him for the scene of a 78-year-old woman standing in a cabin that now housed 3 baby bison. "Ma'am," he stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What in the world is going on here?" Eleanor, exhausted but defiant, explained the entire story. She told him about the patriarch's desperate plea, the tragic discovery of the dead mother, the race against the storm, and the all-night battle to save the weakest calf. She spoke with the simple, unadorned truth of someone who had lived the experience. Ben listened, but his expression shifted from shock to skepticism. A wild bull bison leading her to his calves? It sounded like something out of a fairy tale. His training had taught him that bison were dangerous and unpredictable, not sentient beings capable of complex problem-solving and interspecies communication. He saw a well-meaning but likely confused old woman who had interfered with the natural course of events. "Mrs. Vance, I understand you are trying to help," he said, adopting the patient tone one might use with a child. "But park regulations are very clear. It's illegal to interfere with wildlife. These are wild animals. We have to let nature take its course." "Nature was about to let them freeze to death," Eleanor retorted, her eyes flashing with a fire Ben hadn't expected. "Their father came to me. He asked for my help. I'm not going to let them die now because of some rule in a book." The conflict was clear. Ben saw 3 wild animals that needed to be returned to the park, where their chances of survival on their own were practically zero. Eleanor saw 3 lives she had personally fought for, 3 orphans entrusted to her by their grieving father. The argument escalated. Ben insisted he had to call his superiors and report the situation, that the calves would have to be tranquilized and removed. Eleanor stood her ground, physically blocking the doorway to her small cabin, her frail frame radiating an immovable strength. "You are not taking them," she stated, her voice low and dangerous. "They will die. Their father is right outside. He is watching. You will have to go through both of us." Outside, as if on cue, the patriarch let out a low, rumbling bellow. He had moved closer to the cabin and was watching the uniformed ranger with an unmistakable air of suspicion and hostility. Ben was now caught in an impossible situation. He had a duty to enforce the rules, but he was also faced with a defiant old woman and a 2,000-pound bull who seemed to be corroborating her insane story. What happened next is a testament to the power of truth and the undeniable evidence of one's own eyes. The little bull calf, the one who had almost died, chose that moment to stand up on his wobbly legs and let out a surprisingly strong bleat. He took a few unsteady steps toward Eleanor and began nuzzling her hand, a clear sign of bonding and trust. Ben stared, his skepticism beginning to waver. But the real turning point came from the expert witness he was obligated to call. Dr. Anya Sharma was the park's chief wildlife biologist, a seasoned scientist with 30 years of field experience. When Ben called her and explained the situation, her initial reaction was, like his, one of disbelief. But she also knew Eleanor Vance by reputation. She knew her as a serious, no-nonsense woman who was deeply connected to the wilderness. Intrigued, Dr. Sharma told Ben not to do anything until she could get there herself. It took her 4 hours to reach the remote cabin, navigating the snow-covered park roads. When she arrived, she didn't just observe from a distance. She spent 2 hours with Eleanor, listening to every detail of the story, examining the calves, and most importantly, watching the patriarch. She observed the bull's behavior, his protective stance, his constant focus on the cabin, and his interactions with Eleanor. She saw how he would grow calm when Eleanor was visible in the window and agitated when the ranger approached. She documented behavior that was, from a scientific standpoint, revolutionary. "Ben," Dr. Sharma finally said, her voice filled with a sense of awe that transcended her scientific objectivity. "In 30 years of studying animal behavior, I have never seen anything like this. The level of intelligence, planning, and emotional depth this bull has displayed is off the charts." He didn't just react to a crisis. He assessed the situation, identified a potential ally, and executed a plan to save his offspring. "We are witnessing something that will rewrite textbooks." Dr. Sharma made a decision that went against standard protocol but was guided by scientific integrity and compassion. She declared the situation a unique case of documented interspecies cooperation and placed the calves under Eleanor's temporary care, under official scientific observation. The cabin was officially designated a temporary research outpost. The story, once contained within the valley, exploded. A local reporter got wind of the crazy old lady and the bison babies story, and it was picked up by a national newswire. Within days, Eleanor's isolated cabin became the center of a media firestorm. News vans lined the road. Scientists from around the world began calling, desperate to learn more about the bison who had asked a human for help. The patriarch became a global celebrity, a symbol of fatherly devotion and a startling example of animal intelligence. The public was captivated. Donations poured in to support the calves' care. A fund was established in the patriarch's name to support wildlife research. But the most profound transformation was happening within Eleanor Vance herself. The woman who had shut out the world was now at the center of it. The responsibility of caring for the 3 calves had reawakened her spirit. She was no longer just surviving. She was living with a purpose fiercer than any blizzard. She worked tirelessly, feeding the calves, cleaning up after them, and slowly, carefully, preparing them for a life back in the wild. The patriarch remained her partner in this endeavor. Every day, he would come to the fence line, and Eleanor would bring the calves out for a short period, allowing him to see them, to smell them, to maintain his paternal bond. It was a routine that amazed and humbled every biologist who witnessed. It's 6 months later, the calves, now strong, healthy, and boisterous, were ready for the next phase of their journey. A special protected section of the park had been prepared for them, a large, fenced-in valley where they could learn to be wild under the distant, watchful eye of their father, who roamed the adjacent territory. The day of their release was an emotional one. Eleanor led them to the gate of their new home. The patriarch was there, on the other side of the valley, watching. The 3 young bison hesitated for a moment. Then, as if hearing a call only they could understand, they bounded off into their new life, strong and free. Eleanor watched them go, her heart filled not with sadness, but with a profound sense of fulfillment. Her work was done. The promise she had made to a grieving father had been kept. The story of Eleanor and the patriarch became a modern legend, a powerful reminder that compassion is a universal language and that the capacity for love, grief, and courage exists in the most unexpected of hearts, both human and animal. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had hidden from the world, had been brought back to life by a wild creature's plea for help. And in saving his family, she had rediscovered her own. What do you think this incredible story teaches us about our relationship with the natural world? Has it changed your perception of animal intelligence? The legacy of that fateful winter morning continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have anticipated. The patriarch, as he was now globally known, became more than just a famous animal. He became a catalyst for a fundamental shift in how science and the public viewed the cognitive and emotional lives of wildlife. The research outpost at Eleanor's cabin became a permanent fixture, funded by the foundation established in the patriarch's name. It attracted the brightest minds in animal behavior, all eager to study the bison herd and the remarkable intelligence that had been hiding in plain sight. Dr. Anya Sharma's paper on the incident, titled Deliberate Interspecies Recruitment in American Bison, became one of the most cited publications in the history of wildlife biology, challenging long-held assumptions about the limits of animal cognition. The 3 calves thrived in their protected valley. They grew strong and wild, but they never lost their connection to the 2 figures who had saved them. They would often be seen grazing near the fence line closest to Eleanor's cabin, and they always responded to the distant, rumbling calls of their father. Ranger Ben Carter was also profoundly changed by the experience. He became one of the park's most passionate advocates for a more compassionate and nuanced approach to wildlife management, often using the story of the patriarch to train new recruits. He had learned a powerful lesson that no textbook could ever teach, that true understanding often requires setting aside the rulebook and simply bearing witness. Eleanor Vance lived out her remaining years not in isolation, but as the beloved, matriarch of the valley. Her cabin became an informal classroom for visiting students and a place of pilgrimage for people from all walks of life who had been touched by her story. She had found her voice again, and she used it to advocate for the wilderness she loved. But her most important relationship remained the silent, powerful one she shared with the patriarch. He lived to a ripe old age, the undisputed king of his domain. He would still visit the edge of her property, and they would spend long moments in quiet companionship, a woman and a bison who had forged an unbreakable bond in the crucible of a blizzard. They were a living testament to the fact that in the heart of the wild, where life is raw and unforgiving, the most powerful force of all is the courage to ask for help and the compassion to answer the call. The story of the bison who begged an old lady to save his children became a timeless tale, passed down from one generation to the next. It served as a powerful reminder that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, that intelligence is not limited to mankind, and that the deepest connections are often found in the most unexpected of places. It proved that one single act of trust, one moment of stepping across the divide that separates our species, can change the world. What amazes you most about this story? The bison's intelligence, Eleanor's courage, or the incredible bond they formed? Share your final thoughts below, because tales like this remind us that the world is still full of magic, wonder, and heroes. If we only know where to look, just when you think a story has found its perfect ending, life has a funny way of writing a new chapter. You see, the tale of Eleanor and the patriarch didn't end with the calves being safely released. In fact, that moment of triumph was just the beginning of a new, far more insidious battle. The world had heard the story of a miracle, but some corners of that world don't see miracles. They see opportunities. They see profit. For 2 years, the valley settled into a new kind of peace. The Patriarch Research Outpost, standing proudly next to Eleanor's cabin, became a beacon for compassionate science. The 3 calves, now robust adolescents, roamed their protected section of the park, a sprawling sanctuary carved out just for them. Eleanor had named them Hope, Destiny, and the young bull she called Legacy, and Legacy was special. He had his father's immense size and strength, but he also had his mother's gentle eyes and, most remarkably, he had inherited the patriarch's startling intelligence. He solved problems with a creativity that baffled the researchers. He learned to manipulate the simple latch on a feeding trough meant for mineral supplements, and Dr. Sharma's team once filmed him deliberately leading his sisters along a game trail to a hidden spring during a dry spell, a route that wasn't on any known bison migration path. He was, in every sense of the word, his father's son. The patriarch, meanwhile, continued his reign over the main herd. He was older, his massive frame carrying the faint silver of age, but his authority was absolute. He still made his daily visit to the ridge overlooking the valley where his children lived, a silent, daily communion that spoke volumes. Eleanor, now a spry 80-year-old, had found a new family in the odd collection of scientists, park rangers, and of course, the bison who had saved her from herself. Her heart, once frozen solid, was now a bonfire of purpose. But folks, in our modern world, stories of purity and miracles travel fast, and they often land on the desks of men who see the world not in terms of wonder, but in terms of assets and liabilities. Thousands of miles away, in a glass and steel tower that scraped the sky, a man named Alistair Finch read Dr. Sharma's scientific paper. Finch was the CEO of AgriGen Dynamics, a global biotech corporation with a reputation for aggressive expansion and a legal department that resembled a small army. He wasn't a farmer or a scientist. He was a predator of a different sort, one who hunted for patents and market dominance. When he read about the patriarch's documented intelligence and Legacy's unique genetic makeup, he didn't feel awe. He felt the electric thrill of discovery. He saw a product, a self-thinking, disease-resistant, climate-adaptable livestock model that could be patented, monopolized, and sold for billions. He saw the future of agriculture, and he wanted to own it. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows was seen parked for hours on the public road bordering the park. Men in expensive suits, looking wildly out of place, were spotted using high-powered binoculars, their focus not on the scenic vistas, but on the protected valley. Then the official inquiries began. Polite, professionally worded letters from AgriGen's legal team started arriving at the park superintendent's office. They requested access to Dr. Sharma's research data, citing Public Information Acts. They asked for genetic samples, framing it as a contribution to their own livestock. Improvement programs. Ben Carter, now the senior ranger in charge of the district, denied the requests immediately. He had seen real courage and intelligence up close, and he felt a visceral, protective fury toward anyone who would try to exploit it. "They're circling like vultures, Eleanor," he said one afternoon, standing on her porch, his jaw tight with anger. "They talk about collaboration, but their eyes are cold. They look at Legacy and his sisters like their inventory." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She had fought nature to save those calves. She had battled a blizzard and her own despair. But this was a different kind of storm gathering on the horizon, a storm of human greed, and she knew it would be far harder to survive. The lawyers, when denied, didn't go away. They dug deeper. And what they found was a weapon. A dusty, forgotten land grant from the 19th century, written long before the national park was established. It granted a long-defunct railroad company the rights to all mineral and exploitable resources in a specific quadrant of land. Through a series of shell corporations and acquisitions, AgriGen had bought the rights to that century-old claim. And that quadrant, by a cruel twist of fate, encompassed the entire protected valley where hope, destiny, and legacy lived. Alastair Finch didn't want the minerals. He had declared the bison a biological resource. It was a legally audacious, morally bankrupt claim, but it was just plausible enough to tie up in court for years. And in the meantime, they filed for an injunction to allow them access to their property for surveying and assessment. The system, the very framework of laws designed to protect the sacred land, was being twisted into a weapon against it. The fight wasn't about survival anymore. It was about ownership. It was about whether a creature's life and legacy belonged to itself or to the highest bidder. The patriarch sensed the shift long before the legal papers were served. The scent of the new humans, the sound of their vehicles, the unnatural stillness of their observation, it all put him on edge. His daily visits to the ridge became more frequent, his presence more imposing. Researchers noted a significant change in his behavior. He began actively patrolling the perimeter of the main herd's territory that bordered the access road, a clear, territorial display aimed at the strange new intruders. He was drawing a line in the sand, using the only language he knew, but Alastair Finch didn't speak that language. He only spoke the language of power and money. He saw the patriarch's defiance not as a sign of intelligence, but as a challenge to his authority. And Alastair Finch did not tolerate challenges. The battle for the soul of the valley had begun. Can a small community, a dedicated ranger, an elderly woman, and a herd of bison truly stand against the full force of a multi-billion-dollar corporation? What happens when the laws of nature collide with the laws of man? The legal battle was a nightmare. AgriGen's lawyers, polished and ruthless, descended on the small county courthouse, burying Ben and the park's lone attorney under an avalanche of motions and discovery requests. They argued that their claim was a matter of property rights, a foundational principle of the country. They painted the Park Service as emotional, unscientific bureaucrats standing in the way of progress that could, they claimed, help feed the world. They twisted the narrative with terrifying skill. In the court of public opinion, however, Agri-Gen was losing badly. Eleanor, using her newfound status as a folk hero, became the face of the resistance. She gave interviews not to national news, anchors in sterile studios, but to local bloggers and independent journalists, sitting on her own porch with the vast, untamed wilderness behind her. Her words were simple, powerful, and devastatingly effective. That corporation says they own a piece of paper that gives them the right to take these animals, she said in one interview that went viral, her voice clear and strong. I have a promise I made to a father who asked me to save his children. A piece of paper can be burned. A promise is forever. Let's see which one is stronger. The I Have a Promise movement was born. People from all over the world sent letters, signed petitions, and donated to the Legal Defense Fund. Schoolchildren sent drawings of legacy and the patriarch standing against dark, shadowy figures in suits. The story had a perfect hero and a perfect villain, and the world rallied behind the hero. Dr. Sharma worked tirelessly on the scientific front, publishing a follow-up paper that argued for a new classification of wildlife, ecologically significant individuals. She argued that certain animals, like the patriarch and his offspring, were so vital to the genetic health and social knowledge of their herds that they deserved special protection, akin to the way we protect national monuments. It was a groundbreaking, legal and ethical argument, but it was slow to gain traction in the conservative halls of justice. Alistair Finch grew impatient. The public relations battle was costing him investors and political capital. He decided to force the issue. His lawyers secured a preliminary injunction from a federal judge sympathetic to corporate interests. The injunction granted Agri-Gen a 48-hour window to enter the valley for the sole purpose of environmental and biological surveying. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Ben Carter got the call on a Thursday afternoon. His face went pale. "They're coming, Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Saturday morning. They have a court order. We can protest, but if we interfere, we'll be arrested." The news spread through the community like a wildfire. A sense of grim despair settled over the valley. They had fought so hard, but the cold, impersonal machinery of the law had beaten them. That Friday night, a somber group gathered at Eleanor's cabin. Ben, Dr. Sharma, and a dozen local ranchers and volunteers who had stood with them from the beginning. They felt helpless, defeated. But as they talked, a new kind of resolve emerged. They couldn't stop Agri-Gen legally, but they could bear witness. They would line the entrance to the valley. They would film everything. They would show the world exactly what it looked like when greed came to trample on a miracle. Eleanor, however, had a different kind of faith. Late that night, long after everyone else had left, she walked to the fence line. The patriarch was there, a dark shape in the moonlight, his presence a comforting weight against the darkness in her heart. She looked at him, at this ancient king who had faced down predators and blizzards, and she spoke to him, not in words, but in the silent language of shared understanding they had developed over the years. She projected her hope, her fear, and her unwavering belief in him and his son. She didn't know if he understood the specifics of the human threat, the court orders, and the corporate greed. But she knew with absolute certainty that he understood. His family was in danger, and she knew he would not let them fall without a fight. What happened next, folks, is the kind of coordinated, intelligent, and breathtaking display of animal strategy that will forever silence anyone who claims that humans are the only sentient beings on this planet. The dawn broke on Saturday morning. Cold and clear, the scene was set for a confrontation. On one side, a convoy of Agri-Gen vehicles, including all-terrain trucks, a mobile veterinary lab, and a helicopter circling overhead. Their team consisted of a dozen men, private security armed with tranquilizer rifles and containment gear. On the other side, a thin line of about 50 local protesters, holding signs that read, "We have a promise," and "Bison, not billions." They were led by Eleanor, standing tall in her red parka, a symbol of quiet defiance. Ben and Dr. Sharma stood with her, their faces grim, their own cameras ready to document the inevitable. At precisely 8 a.m., the Agri-Gen convoy pushed past the protesters and rumbled into the valley. Alistair Finch wasn't there himself, of course. He was watching on a live feed from his penthouse office. The plan was simple: use the helicopter to spot and separate Legacy and his sisters, then have the ground team move in quickly with the tranquilizer darts. It was supposed to be a swift, clinical operation. It turned into absolute chaos. As the helicopter descended low over the valley, creating a deafening roar, something extraordinary happened. From the main park territory, on the other side of the ridge, came a sound that started as a low rumble and quickly grew into a thunderous roar. The patriarch was on the move. But he wasn't alone. He was leading the entire main herd, over 200 bison, in a full-blown, coordinated charge. It wasn't a panicked stampede. It was a tactical maneuver. They weren't charging toward the Agri-Gen team. They were charging parallel to them, along the ridgeline, their hooves shaking the very ground. The sheer noise and spectacle were terrifying and disorienting. The helicopter pilot, caught off guard by the sudden massive movement, was forced to pull up and change course. The ground team stopped in their tracks, their attention completely diverted by the awe-inspiring and dangerous display of animal power. It was the perfect diversion. While the Agri-Gen team was distracted by the patriarch's thunderous charge, Eleanor saw a different movement in the valley below. Legacy was acting. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't running blindly from the noise of the helicopter. He was moving with the same deliberate, tactical intelligence as his father. He herded his two sisters not toward the open plains where they would be exposed, but toward the far end of the valley, toward a treacherous, rocky area filled with narrow ravines and steep-sided canyons. It was an area the researchers had deemed impassable for anything larger than a mountain goat. But Legacy knew better. It was the secret place he had once led his sisters to find water. He knew a path, a hidden game trail that snaked through the labyrinth of rocks. The Agri-Gen trucks tried to follow, but the terrain was too rough. The massive vehicles were useless. The ground team tried to pursue on foot, but they were clumsy and slow in the rugged landscape. Legacy and his sisters moved through the canyons with a speed and agility that was breathtaking. They disappeared into the maze of rocks, completely vanishing from sight. The operation had failed, spectacularly. The Agri-Gen team was left standing in the middle of the valley, their high-tech equipment rendered useless, outmaneuvered, and outsmarted by 2 generations of bison. The footage, captured by the protesters, cameras and Dr. Sharma's high-definition equipment, was devastating. It showed a heavily armed corporate team being utterly defeated by the 5-0 strategic genius of the very animals they had sought to exploit. It wasn't a story of brave protesters winning. It was the story of the bison saving themselves. The fallout for Agri-Gen was catastrophic. The video went viral globally under the hashtag Bison blockade. The image of the patriarch leading his thunderous charge and Legacy executing his brilliant escape became iconic. The corporation's stock plummeted. Alistair Finch became a caricature of corporate evil. Under immense political and public pressure, the federal government intervened. The century-old land grant was declared invalid for biological resources, setting a new legal precedent. A new piece of legislation, unofficially nicknamed the Patriarch Act, was fast-tracked through Congress. It granted special federal protection to wildlife of unique genetic and cognitive significance, ensuring that a situation like this could never happen again. Weeks later, when the dust had settled, Eleanor, Ben, and Dr. Sharma stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. They watched as legacy, hope, and destiny emerged from the canyons, safe and sound, and began grazing peacefully. On the far ridge, the patriarch stood his ground, his silent vigil complete. His legacy was secure, passed down not just through DNA, but through taught wisdom and a shared spirit of defiance. Eleanor Vance looked out at the peaceful scene, her heart full. The promise she had made in a snow-filled clearing years ago had been tested by the worst of nature and the worst of humanity, and it had held firm. She had learned that a battle won is a beautiful thing, but a legacy protected, a promise kept, that was something that truly lasted forever. The world had been shown in no uncertain terms that the spirit of the wild was not a commodity to be bought and sold. It was a force to be respected, a wisdom to be learned from, and a treasure that, once lost, could never be reclaimed. The years that followed the defeat of agri-gen dynamics were golden ones for the valley. The Patriarch Act became a landmark, piece of legislation, a shield that protected not just the bison of this one park, but countless other species across the nation from corporate exploitation. The research center flourished, becoming a global hub for the study of animal cognition, but its work was always guided by the principle Eleanor had championed: observation without interference, respect without worship. The world, it seemed, had learned its lesson. But the wilderness operates on a timeline far older and more profound than that of human laws or corporations. It follows the slow, inexorable turning of the seasons, the universal cycle of birth, life, and death. 5 more years passed. Eleanor, now 85, moved with the careful deliberation of her age. Her body was frail, but her spirit remained as untamed as the landscape she called home. The 3 calves she had rescued from a snowbank were now magnificent adults in their prime. Hope and destiny were mothers themselves, their own calves adding to the strength of the new herd that roamed the expanded sanctuary. And Legacy, her little bull who had almost perished by the stove, was a sight to behold. He was the mirror image of his father in his peak, a 2,000-pound giant whose intelligence was now legendary among the scientists who studied him. He was a king. His father, the original patriarch, was now ancient. His once black coat was heavily grizzled with gray, his movements slow, his great, shaggy head often bowed with the weight of his years. He had relinquished control of the main herd to younger bulls, but his presence was still a revered one. He spent most of his days in quiet solitude, often gazing toward the valley where his son now reigned. The final challenge they faced was not a villain in a suit or a predator in the woods. It was time itself. It was the unyielding law of nature. One autumn, as the aspens turned to gold, a new bull appeared at the edge of the park. He was young, massive, and crackling with the raw, aggressive energy of a creature at the peak of his power. He had been driven from his own territory and was looking to establish a new one. His gaze fell upon Legacy's thriving herd, and he saw a kingdom ripe for the taking. This was not an act of malice. It was simply the way of the wild, the timeless dance of dominance and succession. Ben and Dr. Sharma watched with a mixture of scientific fascination and deep anxiety. If Legacy is challenged and loses, Dr. Sharma explained to a worried Eleanor, the social structure could be shattered. This new bull is pure instinct and aggression. The learned behaviors, the cooperative strategies Legacy fosters, all of it could be lost. The patriarch's way could vanish in an afternoon. The confrontation came on a crisp, clear morning. The challenger strode into the valley, his head held high, and issued a deep, bellowing challenge that echoed off the canyon walls. Legacy met him in the center of a great meadow. The 2 females and the younger bison retreated to a safe distance, their eyes wide with tension. For a moment, the 2 great bulls stood facing each other, a portrait of past and future, of wildness and wisdom. The fight, when it began, was a terrifying display of raw power. It was a clash of titans, their massive frames colliding with a force that seemed to shake the earth. Legacy was strong and smart, but the challenger was relentless, fueled by a ferocious single-minded ambition. He fought with a brutal efficiency that Legacy, a leader accustomed to peace, struggled to counter. Slowly, painstakingly, the challenger began to gain the upper hand, forcing Legacy back, step by hard-won step. From the far ridge, the old patriarch watched, his body tense. He let out a low, agonized rumble, the sound of a father helpless to aid his son. He was too old, too weak to intervene. He could only bear witness to the potential fall of his dynasty. The challenger saw his opening. He drove Legacy back against a rock face, cornering him. He gathered himself for a final decisive charge, a blow that would end the contest and establish his rule. Eleanor watched through her binoculars, her heart breaking. It seemed the miracle was finally about to run out, defeated not by greed, but by the simple, brutal arithmetic of nature. But then, something impossible happened. The old patriarch, who had been watching from his distant ridge, did something that defied every known law of bison behavior. He turned his gaze from the fight and looked further up the ridge, toward the main park territory. He let out a call. It wasn't the bellow of a warrior, but the specific, rhythmic, infrasonic call that Dr. Chin had once identified years ago. The call of a leader summoning his allies. In response, a dozen large bulls from the main herd, bulls who had served under the patriarch for years, stopped their grazing. They lifted their heads, and then as one, they began to move. They charged down the ridge, not toward the fight, but forming a living wall, a line of silent, imposing giants separating the valley from the rest of the park. They were hemming the challenger in. But the true miracle was yet to come. The patriarch turned back to the fight, where his son was seconds from defeat, and he called again. A different call this time, a sound so full of paternal authority and command that it seemed to vibrate in Eleanor's own chest. Legacy heard it. In his moment of imminent defeat, he responded to his father's voice. He stopped trying to match the challenger's brute force. Instead, he used the rock face at his back for leverage, ducked his head in a move of tactical genius, and drove upward, not to injure, but to throw the challenger off balance. At that exact moment, the old patriarch made his final move. He limped down from his own ridge and entered the valley. He did not charge. He simply walked with all the remaining dignity and authority of his long reign and stood beside his son. The challenger, now off balance and disoriented, found himself facing not one defeated bull, but two. An intelligent young king and the revered old patriarch standing shoulder to shoulder. Behind them, the silent wall of bulls from the main herd blocked any thought of retreat in that direction. The message was unmistakable, delivered in a language older than words. This family was united. This territory was protected by a legacy of loyalty that brute force alone could not overcome. The young challenger, a creature of pure instinct, was completely confounded by this display of strategic, multi-generational, cooperative defense. He looked at Legacy, at the old patriarch, at the wall of bulls beyond. He hesitated, the fire in his eyes turning to confusion, and then to grudging respect. He let out a low snort, not of aggression, but of concession. He slowly backed away, and with his ambition broken, turned and retreated from the valley, disappearing back into the wilderness from which he came. The old patriarch had not won the fight. Legacy had not won the fight. Their family had won. Their legacy had endured. That winter, the old patriarch's great heart finally gave out. Ben and Eleanor found him one morning, lying peacefully under a snow-dusted pine tree, looking toward his son's valley. He had died as he had lived, a quiet king, a guardian to the very end. Eleanor joined him a few months later, passing away in her sleep, a peaceful end to a life that had become a legend. They buried her on a small hill overlooking the valley, her grave marked by a simple, unadorned stone that read, "A promise kept." The story doesn't end there, of course, because a true legacy never ends. Today, if you visit that valley, you will see legacy, a wise and powerful leader, watching over his own herd. And among the yearlings you might spot a young female with her mother's gentle eyes, or a little bull calf with a spark of his grandfather's defiant intelligence in his gaze. The third generation, the promise renewed. The cycle continues, forever changed by one old woman's compassion and one bull's incredible courage, a testament to the enduring truth that the greatest force in the universe isn't power or dominance, but the simple, unbreakable bond of a family, a bond that time cannot diminish and that even death cannot erase. And so the story became woven into the fabric of the valley itself. It wasn't an ending, but a transformation. The research outpost, now officially named the Vance Patriarch Institute for Cognitive Ecology, continued its groundbreaking work. Dr. Sharma, now a revered elder stateswoman of science, guided a new generation of researchers who came not just to study bison, but to learn about the very nature of consciousness, memory, and the transfer of knowledge across generations in non-human societies. They called it the study of ancestral intelligence, a field that had simply not existed before a grieving father decided to ask a human for help. Ranger Ben Carter, his hair now touched with the same silver that had once graced the patriarch, eventually became the park superintendent. Every year, he would lead the new class of young rangers not to a lecture hall, but to the small, quiet hill where Eleanor's stone stood. He would tell them the whole story, from the blizzard to the blockade, ensuring that the spirit of the place, its foundational promise, was passed down. He taught them that their job was not merely to manage a resource, but to act as guardians for a miracle, to be partners in a conversation that had started long before them. On one such afternoon, as Ben stood with his newest recruits, their young faces filled with awe, he pointed out toward the valley below. There, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, was Legacy's magnificent herd. And near the center, protected on all sides, a newborn calf, the fourth generation, wobbled to its feet for the very first time. The great-grandchild of the patriarch took its first breath in a world that had been fundamentally changed by its ancestors. The story, Ben explained, wasn't something you could read in a history book. It was in the confident way the herd moved, in the defiant spark in a calf's eye, in the rustle of the wind through the pines. It was a living, breathing legacy, a quiet promise renewed with every sunrise, echoing forever in the heart of the valley. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.